By the way, what's the time? Long ago, no one bothered about the time, and the world was happy. But such bliss couldn't last forever, and it was discovered that the time of day could be judged by the position of the sun. This led to the invention of the sundial, upon which the sun's rays cast a shadow, and the time was indicated by the markings on the dial. As in these days, the sun didn't always shine, hence the hourglass came into being. The world has now become time-conscious, and the invention of the clock was a foregone conclusion. And these early Gothic examples were typical of their day. By the 17th century, makers began to add a considerable amount of ornamental work to their clocks, as we can see from this somewhat grotesque and ill-mannered lion. About 1665, the pendulum had been perfected, and thus the grandfather clock came into being. Gradually, time became more important, and clocks found their way into every household, rich and poor alike. Today, clocks and the time they tell have become such an important factor that we even wear the time. No matter what our walk in life, our very existence is ruled by time, and we become complete slaves to the clock, with its ever-moving hands and incessant tick. Ironic, isn't it? But the fact remains, and so it's not surprising that just around the corner we should find a clock factory. So let's go inside and see time in the making, so to speak. We can't fail to notice that the scene is unlike anything we pictured in the stories of our childhood days of the old clockmaker's workshop. For alas, modern clockmaking is like so many other things, just a mass of machinery. Yet when we inspect it from a closer viewpoint, it's nonetheless fascinating. Various machines make the different parts of the clock. Here, for instance, a wheel is being fixed to the pinion. The smallness of the parts makes the job more difficult. Hence, the delicate hands of the ladies are much in demand in this industry. But the next operation can be accomplished by a mere man, so, well, we assume it must be fairly easy. On this machine, the plates are stamped out with amazing rapidity and accuracy. Now the holes are drilled, ready to receive the screws. Further on, we see the hands being made, and reflect that before long they'll be fitted to the clock and order us to get up in the morning and send us to bed at night. All around us the machines hum like a hive of bees, working on the many parts, such as this lever which regulates the timing. In spite of the ingenuity of modern machinery, it is pleasant to know that it does sometimes make mistakes. Thus, continual checks are made, and thanks to the critical eyes of the inspectors, faulty parts are quickly banished and cast again. Yet in spite of this, we must not belittle the abilities of the many machines in this factory, and here is an excellent example of what can be accomplished. Blank wheels are fed into this machine, and within 5 minutes they are completely toothed, ready for using as gears. And in this short space of time, no less than 80 are cut simultaneously, each tooth perfect. Why, it's better than nature can do. Well, time, like our clock, is getting on, and over the way, a capstan machine is also at work, in this case on a brass barrel for the springs. It's hard to imagine how jobs like this were done without the aid of machines. But the fact remains that the clockmaker of 100 years ago achieved success with a few simple tools. Of course, in those days, time was less important, and mass production only referred to rabbits. Here, 2 barrels are cut at once, and a spray of oil washes away the minute brass chips. All around us, the machines work unceasingly, each doing a different job under the watchful eye of its engineer. time, like work, waits for no man, and there are still many more jobs to be done. Wheels must be riveted to the pinion, then tested in a jig. Well, that one's true anyway. Now the finished parts are burnished until they shine like new pins. And as we watch this work, we reflect on the efficiency of these clockmakers. In the days of handmade clocks and watches, none could beat the skill of the English craftsman. But as the industry grew and machines were introduced to do the work of men, our trade was captured by other countries. Now, with our characteristic energy, the craft is ours once more, and today British-made clocks are in demand all over the world. The parts are next sent along to the checking department for a final inspection, and micrometers are used to find the smallest flaws. In another room, the plates are sprayed with lacquer to prevent tarnishing. In fact, they seem to think of everything here. Having made so many bits and pieces, it's only natural that sooner or later the time comes to put them all together. And in the assembly room, the mechanical jigsaw begins. These fellows are old hands at the job and know where every little part fits in. In fact, it only takes them 45 minutes to assemble the whole mechanism with the striking apparatus and make it work. When all the little wheels are fixed into position and the top plate set, the electric nut tightener comes into action and the nuts screwed firmly home. Any amateur mechanic knows that fixing a spring into a barrel is no easy task, but here a special machine is used which makes the job child's play. Which brings us to the youngest member of the staff, but he has the skill of many twice his age. Yes, it's nearly lunchtime, but he's a fast worker and will put another spring into the mechanism before he knocks off. This boy should go far in a short time. In less than an hour, the works are completely assembled, the springs wound, and the movement put on test for at least 2 weeks to ensure that it is working smoothly. While a few drops of oil help the wheels to turn. And here the hammers are being adjusted on a striking clock and tuned to concert pitch. A delicate operation this, for the timing must be perfect. At last the job is done, and the finished clocks are left on the shelf to await their cases. But at frequent intervals they must be sounded with this tube to make sure that they are on beat. By this method, an expert can tell if there is the slightest irregularity. Now let's move on and see how the cases are made. In these days, wood is fashionable, and so we find ourselves in the carpenter shop with the wholesome smell of shavings in the air. Compared with the building of the movements, this is a fairly simple job, and we notice the lack of machinery around the workshop. This is still a handicraft, and apart from a few nails, only a glue pot is needed to fix the supports to the main bodywork. With that part of the business done, the top has to be fitted into position, and the case is almost complete. But like most trades, this one has its own little tricks, and here we see something of the gentle art of making veneer. A thin strip is carefully glued to the base and put into this press. Within a few minutes, the press is opened again, and the wood is stuck firmly and bent into the desired shape. Walnut or mahogany finish can be obtained by using these thin layers of veneer, which are glued to the main part of the case. Now all that remains to be done is carefully to trim away the edges with a very sharp knife to avoid splitting the veneer, and within a matter of minutes the case is completed. Well, almost, for the rough edges must be smoothed off on the sandpaper belt. Of course, they must be given the inevitable spray of paint, so that the purchaser will get his full money's worth, while the finishing off is left to the hands of an expert painter. At this point, you might think that the clock is complete, which proves you haven't really looked at one, for like the rest of us, a clock must have a face. These are designed in full detail, with the seconds carefully spaced with dividers. In the trade, this is known as spacing out the chapters, but when we asked for an explanation of this curious expression, they quickly changed the subject. Now the artist puts in the numerals, which are filled in with Indian ink, and slowly the face takes on its familiar appearance. When finished, it is pinned on the wall to be photographed by this huge camera, which produces a line block. The plate holder is inserted and the slide withdrawn. Usually arc lamps are used for this process, and an exposure of about 4 minutes is required to obtain the right density. The exposed plate is developed with special chemicals, and then the sensitizing solution is poured over it, taking care that it flows evenly. Now it's attached to this contraption and twirled round to make sure that the superfluous liquid is whisked off and an even film is produced. After this hectic treatment, the plate is put into the pressure printing frame and a second exposure is made. Once more, the arc lamps come into play, and the process is not unlike printing in ordinary photography. Then the plate is removed from the frame, and a film of ink is applied and thoroughly rubbed in, making the albumen waterproof. When held under a tap, the other parts wash off, and the image of the dial appears. Now all that remains is to reproduce the faces from this zinc offset, which is placed in the special printing machine. As the roller moves forward, the image is reproduced on a rubber blanket, and then onto another dial. Thus, any number of faces are turned out. And so at last, our clock is completed, ready to call us from our slumbers and drive us off to work. But modern clockmakers try to sugar the pill with fancy timepieces, and in Devon is a quaint church clock on which the words "Dear Mother" have taken the place of the numerals on the dial. But perhaps the most famous clock in the world is our own Big Ben, whose voice is known by all. 320 feet up is the huge four-face dial, each one 23 feet in diameter, with a big hand of 14 feet. Built nearly 100 years ago, this is considered one of the finest clocks ever constructed, and does credit to our engineers of yesterday. When first built, it had to be wound by hand, but now an electric motor does the job. The weights are 2.5 tons each, while the movement covers an area of nearly 40 feet square. The The pendulum, 13 feet long, is so perfectly balanced that pennies rest on it for years. But it is this 14-ton bell that is really Big Ben, named after Sir Benjamin Hall. And to the daily question, what's the time, Big Ben always has the right answer.